In this episode of the FXTM educational series, we're going to be taking a look at trading psychology or behavioral finance. Now, this is a very interesting topic because it describes things that are going on inside our own heads, not on the charts, that may have a negative impact on our overall trading performance. Now, the first one that I'm going to start with is I'm going to abbreviate it as post hoc. Now, what this is, post hoc analysis, is actually short for post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is a Latin phrase, which means if B follows A, then therefore A must have caused B. And we see this in the press all the time. So for example, let's say that on a given day, we saw the euro to the US dollar had a particularly large drop to the downside, something like that. Now, if that day happened to be, let's say, the first Friday of the month, well, it's quite likely you're going to see a lot of headlines that say, well, the euro to the US dollar today, it dropped like crazy because the labor report that came out from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics was particularly good or potentially particularly bad. So in other words, what they're doing is that after the fact, so post hoc, after the fact, they're attributing a reason. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about a couple of solutions that we can use to deal with the risks presented with biases. And at the very end of the video, I'm going to talk about probably the best technique for just dealing with this in your own trading as well. But what we can do here is always have the motto of putting things to the test. Ask for evidence. So in this specific example, if we see that the labor report is being used to explain why the euro to the US dollar went up or down on a given day, well, fortunately, we have access to that information. So we can very easily say, well, in the past, how likely was it that the dollar or the euro or what have you has gone up or down depending on whether that report was above or below a certain number or above or below expectations? Does the explanation that's been presented to me here in the news or by other analysts, does it actually make sense? So we never take things on face value, and certainly not the headlines, but instead we try to alleviate this risk by putting things to the test and being really consistent about it. The next bias that we all have to deal with is something that we call the disposition effect. Now, the disposition effect is something that we could also re-describe a little bit as the tendency that investors have to cut their winners short and let their losers run and run and run. Well, why is this? Why is this? Well, there's been some very interesting work done in behavioral finance to try to explain why investors act this way, and it's called prospect theory. In fact, the Nobel Prize was awarded for it some years ago, and it is a very interesting idea. It basically describes a curve that looks like this. So I've drawn a little graph here, and along the y-axis, I'm going to call that value. So above the midpoint here, those will be positive values. Underneath the midpoint here will be negative values. So in other words, how much do you value? Not in monetary terms, but from a personal perspective, how much do you value gains over here on the right-hand side or losses? So obviously, losses would be a negative, and we would expect that we attach a negative value to those. Gains would be a positive, and we would expect we would attach a positive value to those. Well, as it turns out, according to prospect theory, basically humans, we tend to value things in a counterintuitive way, where yes, we do certainly feel good about our gains, and the greater those gains are, however, the value that we attach to them, it kind of flattens out. However, with losses, we really continue to decline here quite a bit, where if we were to find a point on the x-axis here that represented a positive value that was the inverse of a negative value over here, so let's say this was a positive 100 and this was a negative 100, well, what we would find is that there is a significant difference between the negative value we attach to that loss that is of the same size as this gain that we attach much less positive value to. Now, how do we deal with this? Well, I found one of the most effective things that we can do is try to plan our trades out in advance. But the second thing is really just being aware of the fact that we probably all suffer from this to some degree or another. So if we're aware of it, then we can address more honestly our motivations for when we have a winning trade on our hands and we're tempted to take those profits off the table. For example, asking ourselves questions like, would I open this trade brand new today? Would I short this particular pair right now? If I'm long, well, maybe if I wouldn't short it, maybe I should at least rethink it a little bit. Not necessarily that we have to look at everything in a binary perspective, but rather that we use this as a reason to readdress why we might be doing something And is this an emotionally driven decision to cut this winner off, or to let this loser run and run and run because I don't want to recognize it because it will cause me too much pain? Or is this more rational? Is there a legitimate reason why I would want to take these actions? I find this particular cognitive bias of enumeration of favorable circumstances to be particularly vexing because it's so tied up with some of our personal feelings or political feelings or favoritism that we might have towards our country of origin and so forth. Now, what this basically means is we only look for information that tells us what we already want to know. So in other words, for example, let's say that a trader is analyzing the euro and they believe that easing programs that have been launched or may be launched by the European Central Bank are bad for the euro for whatever reason. Now, they may be perfectly valid reasons, but they will therefore only evaluate information that backs up their preconception when they don't know for sure whether that is in fact going to hurt the euro or within the time frame of their trade. So if they don't know for sure that it's going to be able to do that, they will instead retreat into sources of information and analysis that only agrees with them. The risk, of course, is obvious, and that is that we'll base trading decisions on information that has no correlation with a successful outcome. It may be more random, or we may persist, if you've ever heard the expression of a perma-bear or a perma-bull. So these are traders that they'll be right eventually, but will they be able to withstand the losses in the meantime? Well, that's the real question. And oftentimes those attitudes are reinforced by only evaluating information that's going to agree with their political or economic or other viewpoint as to what the effect is of these fundamental issues on the value of their currency, positive or negative. So how do we deal with this? Well, I find that the most effective thing that we can do to try to deal with this particular cognitive bias is to intentionally seek out sources of information that disagrees with us. Now, that may be challenging and it can be very frustrating, and you don't have to wind up agreeing with them, but at least you'll learn something and can start to temper some of the assumptions that you might have had otherwise. The net result being that you're more thoughtful and consistent about the trades that you're taking and more honest about what your expectations are for a successful outcome. Now, besides some of the tips that we've already discussed in this video for dealing with some of these cognitive biases, what are some of the other things that we can do? Now, I have found that very little can match the effectiveness of these two techniques. Number one, keep a journal. Number two is follow your rules. So with a journal, what do we mean by that? So I always say your journal should include a record of your analysis, the dates that you were evaluating the trade, what about your entries, potential exits, when did you add risk to the position, or when did you take away risk from the position, when did you adjust the stop loss, for example, or add a complementary position or a hedge to it, and so forth. This information is absolutely critical, but it's not more important than finally recording changes to your trade. This is something that is a bit of a theme in investor psychology or trading psychology, that we tend to go at a trade with a fairly well-reasoned idea, but then sabotage ourselves because of these biases. Well, recording the changes, the reasons why we would change our trade outlook or change the trade itself, will help us to identify, well, what's really going on here? And even more important than that, if a system that we're using it stops working, well, if we don't know why or how we have potentially changed the rules within that system, then we don't know what exactly has stopped working. So we have no idea what to adjust. So we can wind up getting caught in a bit of a negative feedback loop because we just don't know what's been going on. Now, the rules are another one. This is basically a matter of just imposing consistency. So are we doing the same thing, more or less, in the same circumstances over and over again? Again, so that we can identify where things are going well, so we can repeat them, and where things may not be going very well, so we can avoid them or adjust accordingly. Consistency is really key, but number two, and this goes back to the disposition effect, is that it allows us to maintain a much more healthy win to loss and risk to reward ratio. Now, we've gone into additional detail on those two concepts in another video in this series as we talked about trading systems and developing expectancy. But that's all based on the underlying concept that we're going to be following rules in the first place so that we can develop a forecast of, well, what are we really going to expect from our trading activity? So Using a journal and using our rules is really going to take us a long way to being more rational and reasonable about our trading expectations and our cognitive biases.